Well, hello, everyone. I'm Laura Murray, and I'm the president of the National Museum of Language. And on behalf of our museum, I want to welcome everyone who's joined us today for what is going to be a really amazing presentation about vampires. So before we get into that, I don't want to take too long, but I want to give those of you who are new to the National Museum of Language a little introduction to what our museum is. Um, we are an all virtual museum, which makes us, I believe, unique in the United States and around most of the world. We don't have a building, but we do everything virtually, and including our speaker presentations, and we have exhibits up on our website. We do interviews with people. We have blog posts. We have liaisons in 40 of the 50 states. And so we have quite a network. We're also networked with a group called International Network of Language Museums, which has 27 members, I think, at last count. We meet on about every other month and share information about our various museums. Um, so just a little more background on our museum. This museum was initially conceived of being a more traditional museum with a building. Um, it was first registered with the IRS as a nonprofit in 1998, but it didn't actually open doors until 2008. And we had a small physical space in College Park, Maryland, which is right outside Washington, D.C., near the University of Maryland. But that only lasted for 5 years till 2013 because we ran out of money to operate a physical space. So at that point, um, we started being a kind of hybrid. We would use community spaces to do some exhibits, temporary exhibits, and have speaker programs. And then we started experimenting with doing more online, digitizing some of our exhibit materials and doing the speaker programs over um, Zoom. I think mostly we've just used Zoom. So that was like 2014 to 2020. And then when the pandemic hit in 2020 and everything was locked down, um, our president, Nedved, is here with us today. He's the immediate past president before I came in, made the strategic decision that we would go all virtual. And that was pretty revolutionary. And yet it turned out to be an excellent decision because we were able to reach much broader audiences from around the world, such as all of you wonderful folks who are here with us today from far-flung places as well as in the neighborhood. So it's great. Now, we are an independent museum. We're not affiliated with any government agency or educational institution or even with other museums. Uh, but this gives us the freedom to do the kinds of things that we're interested in without a lot of bureaucracy. And I worked for the federal government for 34 years, so I know about bureaucracy. So anyway, we're funded solely by donations and grants. Um, and we look at language very broadly. We look at issues like language learning, how language is used in society, such as the types of jobs that are based on language, preservation of languages that are going extinct, and linguistic and cultural diversity. Um, we And just to give you an example of some of the exhibits that are on our website, if you haven't looked at our website, almost all our exhibits are multilingual. For example, we have an exhibit of international children's stories in their original language and in English translation. It's called Sharing Our Stories. We have another multilingual exhibit called The Power of Poetry, which examines poetry from around the world on social justice themes. Um, and we have a new multilingual exhibit called What Makes People Laugh. It's about international humor. Again, we have jokes from many, many countries and in their original languages and in English. We also have an exhibit of what some call the world's oldest joke book, dating back to Greece in about 4th century AD, Philagelos. And so those are some of our exhibits. Um, we do community engagements in person from time to time. Um, and we also have people can write for us in our blog. We do interviews, and of course, we have the speaker series. So that's us in a nutshell. And now I want to get to the part you're really interested in, was hearing about our speaker for today. So I'm very honored to introduce Dr. Thomas Jesus Garza from the University of Texas at Austin. He's an associate professor in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies, and he's the founding director of the College of Liberal Arts Texas Language Center at UT Austin. He teaches courses on Russian language and culture, as well as world literatures and Russian popular culture. For over 40 years, from 1979 to 2020, he traveled frequently to Russia and lived in Moscow for several years. And it was during that period, he got his doctorate from Harvard University in 1987. And then, as I understand, around 2020, it became difficult for him to travel to Russia. So he hasn't been going there as much recently. Nevertheless, he's still teaching, and his tenure at Texas is more than 30 years, and he's received many awards for his teaching. Or at the undergraduate and graduate level, he was inducted into the university's Academy of Distinguished Teachers in 2003. He got a University of Texas Regents Outstanding Teaching Award in 2009. He was chosen a Texas Top 10 instructor by a UT Austin alumni group. And he's published widely in a number of language journals and journals relating to Slavic and East European and Russian studies and current history. And he's just completed a book on machismo in contemporary Russian and Mexican cultures, and from films, and currently working on some new projects. So he's a very distinguished scholar in the field of Russian language, and we're just so lucky that he's taking the time to come and talk to us today about vampires. So with that, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Garza, and you can take it away.
Laura, thank you so much for that, that overly kind introduction. I really do appreciate it. I'm very grateful to you, Laura Murray, as well as to Greg Medved from the Museum of Language for the very kind and generous invitation to be able to join you all today, as well as Emily Murray for helping me with all the technology and issues regarding to getting us to be able to meet today in this wonderful virtual way. It is so nice to be able at this time of the year, as we are approaching the Halloween season, Dia de los Muertos, and other kind of reaffirmations of life and death, to talk about this subject that is both culturally, linguistically, intertwined with so many cultures. I've somewhat tongue-in-cheekily called it drops of Slavic blood, although the two of the main features of what I'll be talking about today are actually not Slavic at all, but from the region of Eastern Europe within the Slavic communities. So with that said, let's dive right in and get started. Hopefully you'll recognize, as we get into the first bits here, some of the films from these movie posters or television series that are coming up. These are simply peeled off from the last 12, 15 years of English language productions of vampires and vampire stories that have been released both in the United States and globally. And what it's meant to show, and I'm sure as you're watching these bits come in front of on the screen, you're thinking, but what about? Because there are just so many, and too many, in fact, to cram onto one screen, is what is it about this story, this mythos that is so incredibly profound and universal, that makes it so endearing and enduring in cultures around the world? And there are different kinds of answers to the question. So from my perspective, it has everything to do with our fascination with being human beings, being alive, and wondering then what happens to us after we are alive no more. What is death? Is there any way to, as it were, cheat death? What comes after death? Do we fear death? All of these kinds of questions that we ask each other in colloquial conversation, as well as in some of our most profound philosophical and literary works throughout history, all tie back into the idea of, well, what if we could live forever? The vampire story, the vampire myth in the Western world and in the Eastern world and globally involves precisely these incredibly human and humane questions. So I want to take us to that world. As I said, I'm calling it a bit cheekedly the Slavic world, but really the world of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and yes, all the way across to the largest country in the world, Russia. So the area that's probably most in the English-speaking and Western world associated with the vampire story is one that many people think it doesn't even really exist, that it's a sort of Disneyfied place called Transylvania that appears in so many stories, most notably Bram Stoker's Dracula at the end of the 19th century, as a place that is the locus of the vampire story. Truth be told, the word itself, vampire, comes in not from that region, but rather the storyline moves in from the eastern part of the world, probably Southeast Asia, across the southern, the Indian Peninsula, and then across the Middle East through Turkey, and then up through the Balkans into Europe. The word itself, vampire, probably has, and again, there's linguists argue about what is the real etymological origin of the word, but most agree, I'm one of them that agrees with this, that the vampyr or upyr root has the notion of drinking out of or drinking from. That has no reference to blood in it whatsoever, but it does have this sense of those who take something from something else. And I'll kind of leave that there for now because it'll be a theme I'll return to a few times over the next 45 minutes or hour or so to pull some thoughts together. But back to Transylvania. So there, the circle around there is a general area. It's a little bit actually closer to the Hungarian border than this particular map shows, but to say it's more or less centered in the contemporary area that we know of as Romania. It is not a Slavic land, but rather kind of trans-Slavic. So to the south, Slavic countries, Bulgaria, all the former Yugoslavia, to the north and to the east, from the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and then, of course, Belarus, and then on across to Russia. That's the larger part of the Slavic lands. But nestled within this region, Romania becomes the focal point because of this location of the area Transylvania, of not a mythic vampire, but two real vampires in historic terms. So look at the area a little bit close up. What made it such an interesting place geographically and culturally, and indeed linguistically, for the story to take root in two historical figures from this region? Well, a lot has been said about the name itself, Transylvan, across the forests, this idea that these are lands that are not ours, but rather those on the other side of something. Geographically, if you look up to the northeastern border in this area, up here, you see the Carpathian Mountains, so a big natural border on the side that butts up against the rest of the real Slavic world, and then down along the southern border, the Transylvanian Alps. You have this wonderful kind of chevron shape of natural protection from the rest of Europe. So one can look at it as protection from Europe and the rest of to the south, the Balkans. One can also look at it as isolation from the rest of the Slavic-speaking world. But that meant that this region of Transylvania became, as a principality, even as far back as the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries, very much its own place. And as a locus for a story, it couldn't be geographically more interesting. So who, of course, is the person behind the place, the man, the name that we all know? Yes, there was indeed a real Dracula, Vlad Dracula, the son of Dracul. If anyone knows any of the languages in that Indo-European group that take a possessive case with the adding of an A at the end to mean of that family or of that person. So we add on to the family Dracul the A, and we get Vlad Dracula, the son of Voivod Dracul, a ruthless leader in the 15th century of that area of Transylvania, and then his son who follows, Vlad Dracula. The word in the middle is an interesting, not quite sidebar, but just an interesting part, of course, linguistically, to the full nominal force behind this leader. The word in the middle is tsepesh, which is the word given to him based on reputation. It means one who impales, the impaler. So Vlad Tsepesh Dracula rules the region of Transylvania, more formally Wallachia or Wallachia, in the 15th century. So his date's not all that long, as you can see, 1431 to 1476. And within that period, pretty much most of his life, he is in that position of being prince of and ruler of Wallachia, Transylvania. Where that middle name comes from was, many of you probably know the mythos around this. The story was that Dracula managed over the course of both his father's reign and then his own reign, the Dracula family managed to keep at bay the movement of Muslim Turks into this region, moving from the Turkish peninsula, the Ottoman Empire, moving ever so further up the Balkan Peninsula toward the area of present-day Romania and Hungary, never managed to take that region, partially because of that natural border of the Transylvanian Alps along the southern border, but mostly because of the efforts of the Dracula family, which were able to use techniques such as this one depicted in an 18th century woodcut, showing Dracula not only practicing the act that gave him that middle name moniker of the Impaler, but also actually dining while one of his servants chops up an individual who had been impaled into pieces, and the suggestion by this bit of propaganda from from empire within Central Europe, the suggestion that Dracula actually not only drank of human blood but ate human flesh, neither of which is documented in any kind of historic evidence, but the evidence that he did indeed use impalement of his enemies and then place those stakes of impaled humans along the borders where the troops were coming in is very much both documented and almost certainly true. It also proved to be an extremely effective military maneuver to keep those troops at bay. And one only has to ask the question, how would you feel about moving forward or cross a line where you've seen your own comrades being staked by a ruler and his army? The immediate suggestion is one of, well, what are we actually in for here? What are we doing? And is this something I'm willing to continue doing? As a result, Dracula was able to keep at bay those the invading Turkish troops for the entirety of the Dracula reign. The area that we call Transylvania today, even today, still was never occupied by those troops, though most of the lands to the south and even a few to the north and east were taken by the Ottoman Empire. One of the more interesting ways of looking at how this character of Dracula, historic figure, I should say, of Dracula, still remains in the minds and, in some senses, the hearts of Romanians and Transylvanians today as almost a kind of Robin Hood character, an outlaw, renegade, yes, in some cases, horrific criminal, hence the association with the idea of a vampire, someone bloodthirsty. How it is that this person continues to be regarded as a kind of national hero. It has a lovely filmic depiction in the opening of the 1992 film of Francis Ford Coppola and his reimagining of Bram Stoker's Dracula, nearly 100 years after its publication. And in the opening scene, in just a couple of minutes of images and text, we can get the entirety of the history that's behind the fall of much of the Christian empire to the south, and then because of the invasion of the Ottoman Empire, but then the movement toward Transylvania being stopped by Dracula and his troops in just a couple of minutes of film. So with that, I like always to use this even in my classes to be able to talk about the kind of ways one might imagine history being depicted at the end of the 20th century to a modern audience. So take us to that scene just for a couple of minutes.
Year 1462. Constantinople had fallen. Muslim Turks swept into Europe with a vast superior force, striking at Romania, threatening all of Christendom. From Transylvania arose a Romanian knight of the Sacred Order of the Dragon, known as Dracula. On the eve of the battle, his bride, Elisabetta, whom he prized above all things on earth, knew that he must face an insurmountable force from which he might never return.
Domnul fie laudat. Amon vinci. Elisabetta.
The vengeful Turks shot an arrow into the castle, carrying false news of Dracula's death. Elisabetta, believing him dead, flung herself into the river.
My prince is dead. All is lost without him. May God unite us in heaven.
Și-a rămas îngroviat. Sufletul ei nu mai poate fi salvat. Este blestemată. Asta e legea lui Dumnezeu.
Asta este răsplata mea pentru apărarea bisericii. Lege nu doar ce spațiul de cheltele cu tine ca să vedeți ce Dumnezeu!
Horrifies carne mortis. Și răspund. Moarte!
there you have it. I use that in my very first day. I teach a course on the history of the vampire story and the Slavic and East European lands to a fairly largish, usually around 150, 200 students every other year at the University of Texas. And I use this as kind of that hook to hope that after watching something like that, condensing about a dozen years of history into 3 minutes, that they might see the course has something to offer them. But that is indeed a very Hollywood stylized version of the story, obviously using bits and pieces of what we do know of the real biography of Dracula, of Vlad Tepes Dracula, as the basis of the text, but then stylizing it in a way that makes it speak to a late 20th century audience, not letting up at all, though, on the way that the myth, the story of this real historic figure remains so alive, as it were, like a vampire remains alive and very much in the heart of those from the region. There's an interesting bit, that line that Dracula uses and Coppola picks up on as kind of a centerpiece for the film version. The blood is the life, that's taken from the Ecclesiastes line of biblical text. Doesn't finish the line, of course, which is the blood is the life, and therefore thou shalt not drink of the blood. Rather using the first part of it as the reason, having the church, the Catholic Church, abandon Dracula and his family after his wife commits suicide, as the reason, maybe the linchpin, the tripwire of why he goes from being in a sense, bloodthirsty, with quotes around it, military leader, to becoming one who believes that he needs to find vengeance against the church that betrayed him as a way to get in. Sorry about that. I'd be through there. Sorry about that again. Gotta get to the next one. Come on, there we go. It's the clip that didn't want to die as well. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that less than 100 years after Dracula, a distant relative of his, takes the reign in the area of Hungary and re-adds the name from the early part of the vampire myth from the medieval period and pre-medieval period even, as being a heavily imbued with women figures. Most of us in the 21st century see the vampire image as being very, very much heavily on being in performances of masculine and even toxic masculine behavior, very much a male-dominated, as it were, role. But indeed, as I said, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the so-called Blood Countess of Hungary, Elizabeth Báthory, from Hungary, just as I mentioned, about 100 years later, after the reign of Dracula. Báthory's reign was marked by an obsession after the ruthless rule of her husband, wanting to make sure that she was not considered any less successful of a ruler, maintained the same kind of, as it were, bloodthirsty, a violent way of keeping her rule going. But in addition to that obsession she had with not wanting to be viewed as a weak woman ruler, she also did have an obsession with her own youth and beauty. And there are many, many stories, none of them, of course, being given the period of the time and the way documentation was done, ways to verify stories. But the majority of diary entries and journal entries that do flow together tell us a unified story of a woman who became so obsessed with her beauty, and for one way or another finds that painting herself with young, fresh, virginal blood of girls would maintain her youth through her looks, became part of the story of how she managed to bring to her ruling castle, Báthory Castle, in Hungary, somewhere between 400 on the low end and about 600 at the higher end, young girls who were to be supposedly taught the manners of the court, but instead became fodder for her own vanity and youth. They were systematically murdered, and their blood was then used for her to be able to maintain her beauty. The irony, or maybe the justice that occurs in her life as this kind of ruthless ruler, comes to an end when she more or less runs out of the local peasant class from which she'd been pulling her victims, and begins to take from the merchant class young women because of their rank. A little bit again of social justice here. Their rank, the lives of those women of lower social standing were finally avenged because the families brought her, Elizabeth, to court, to trial, and ultimately she was confined for the remainder of her life. She was not executed, but was confined to prison until she died. But I needed to bring that into balance. The two big real historic vampiric figures of Vlad Tepes Dracula and Elizabeth Bathory from the same region. The way, of course, that these stories come to most of the English-speaking world is largely to the efforts and the talents of this person, of course, Bram Stoker, who in 1897 publishes the novel that becomes the basis of almost all of the other stories that come to us later. What I always find very interesting about the connection of Stoker's Dracula and the historic figure of Vlad Tepes Dracula is easily documentable in the British Library through a number of manuscript pages one can look at. The story, or his novel, went through several iterations of titles of the name of the hero, anti-hero of this blood-drinking creature that he had created, invented, imagined, and down to almost the point of its publication, as you can see on the left-hand title page mock-up, the story had simply been called The Undead. And then if we look on the right-hand side, you can see a very tiny print. I'm sorry, it's kind of faint there, but really if you push close to your screen in the upper left-hand corner, you can see by looking through travel logs, he'd come across the stories and the tales of Vlad Tepes Dracula and liked the sound, the way the name actually, as he writes in the scribblings along the margin, in the marginalia there, the way the name itself sounded evil, as he said. He wanted to make sure that he gave it this rank of count to make the story one also of empire and of power differentiation and distinction. But that is how the English-speaking world and the historic Dracula story become merged into one text. How that story then moves on to film at the beginning of the 20th century is a whole nother bit of the mythos. After Dracula, Bram Stoker's death, his widow did not want the novel made into any kind of either serialized format or film format in the new medium of cinema that was developing. And so the very, very progressive French director F.W. Murnau from Germany wanted to turn the Dracula story into a film, making it the first full-length vampire movie. He was denied the rights to the novel, but went forward with it, simply using the exact storyline, but changing all the names of the characters. And from that, we get our first filmic vampire, Nosferatu. And there he is in all his glory. The look, by the way, if you go to the section of Stoker's novel where he describes the monster, the vampire himself, many of the attributes taken on by Murnau's character, played by Max Schreck of Nosferatu, are taken directly from that description. The large domed forehead, bald through the center. The difference there is in the novel, a lot of hair around the sides. Nosferatu and Murnau chose to play it instead fully bald. But then I think one of the most telling descriptors were the ears coming to a point and two pointy teeth in the front, as Stoker describes them, rat-like almost in the front of the mouth of Dracula, in this case, Nosferatu. The images that come out of this silent film are some, in my opinion, some of the most wonderfully vampirically horrible and horrific that have ever been put on film. I think even to present day, this silent movie holds up extremely well as one of the best readings of the Dracula story. In the States and in the English-speaking world, the first Hollywood-style vampire, of course, comes just in the age of the Depression, 1931's production by director Todd Browning, taking now, after the long enough period after Bram Stoker's death and the death of his widow and the estate changing over, this film is allowed to be called both by the name Dracula, and all the characters maintain the names of the characters in the novel. One of the most interesting bits that does connect it back now to my Slavic Eastern European connection here was Browning's incredibly risky and yet wonderful choice of choosing an unknown Hungarian actor, new in Hollywood, named Bela Lugosi, to play the lead role, the titular role of the vampire. His given name, Bela Ferenc Deshko Blasko, obviously not very Hollywood, so shortened down to Bela, and indeed by English pronunciation, Lugosi. Played the role very much, still not speaking English nearly at all. In the director's commentary and notes on the film, it many times remarked upon how Lugosi, if you watch the film very carefully, will look to one side or the other of the sight line because he's reading off of small note cards that have his lines written out phonetically for him to read. So really wonderfully interesting bit of a kind of cultural merger of the region from which the Dracula story actually comes, the Hungarian-Romanian border, as did Blasko as a human being, Blasko, and the Hollywood connection of the story. But I'm going to take us now back to the kind of Slavic lands, and this time, yes, the Slavic lands, not simply of Eastern Europe, but indeed of Russia, and talk for a little bit about make the literary connection of the vampire story to the Russian lands in particular, looking at Russia's kind of high period, the golden age, as it's often called, of Russian literature, from the early 19th century on into the second half of the 19th century. And even some of the most well-known Russian poets and writers of the period were looking at the tradition that would become known as the Gothic from British literature, German literature, and some French literary writers of the same period, and then work to try to reimagine those works into the vernacular of Russian at the time as a literary language, which forms much later in Russia than it did in those other Western European languages I just mentioned, but nonetheless become a real part of the Russian early 19th century literary tradition. Vasily Zhukovsky, whom you see on the left, one of the early writers who actually straddles between the period of sentimentalism. Some of his very early works, in fact, have very much the almost stern notions of a kind of sentimental journey, as it were, in his early works. But by the time we get to the beginnings of the 19th century, he's been reading enough German Gothic literature, especially in the poetic works, that he's decided to try his own hand at it and creates the earliest first works by first translating Bürger's Leonora from the German into Russian, into a version called Lyudmila in 1808, becoming one of the very first, if not some consider, one of them considers it really the first of what can be called early Russian Gothic, and then reworks that same storyline into a fully Russian character and character line in his long poem called Svetlana in 1813. This takes the themes from Bürger's Leonora of a bride being abducted by a corpse, actually, into the literary language and brings it right up to date in 1813 of the current Russian literary tropes of early Romanticism, but also with the kind of rhythm and rhyme that was marking the language at that time. The real master, though, of that poetic tradition was actually one of Zhukovsky's students, Alexander Pushkin. Many consider him the greatest writer of all time, but certainly of the 19th century, there's no question. Among all of his many works, Pushkin dabbled in the Gothic with topics such as In the Bridegroom, really reprising the idea of a bride's abduction, not so much by a dead man, but rather that her groom turns out to be a grave robber who gives her the wedding ring that he has pulled off the finger of a finger that he's cut off of a dead man, a person he's just murdered. So that's kind of just a reimagining of the earlier work by Zhukovsky. But then he experiments with his own verse in poems such as The Drowned Man. Put it one stands up there for you to get a sense, both a little bit of the rhythm of it as best one can render it into English translation, but mainly of the kind of tropes of the undead that come in. This is toward the very, very end of the story. That's about two young children who playing by a riverbank find a corpse that they pull up onto the bank. Their father quickly pushes them away from the corpse and takes them back into the house. But then from that day on, this corpse comes to their house in the evening then and taps on the window pane and torments them. And this is the ending of one of the last stanzas. People tell a dreadful rumor. Every year, the peasants say, waiting in the worst of humor for his visitor that day. As the rainstorm is increasing, nightfall brings a hurricane, and the drowned man knocks unceasing by the gates and at the pane. So that even again in this height of Russian Romanticism, 1825, the work is written. There is the Gothic creeping in with all beauty and full language. By the end of the 19th century, other literary writers of the time, including the Ukrainian writer Nikolai Gogol, who wrote both in Ukrainian but predominantly in Russian, though with many, many Ukrainian references, start turning. You probably know his works mostly from pieces like Dead Souls, but he also turned to Gothic themes in his writing with one piece in particular called V, or the V, a name he just imagines on his own of a mythic creature from the underworld that comes in to point out the hypocrisies, especially among those who are God-fearing of the period. So this is the line from the priest who's trying to pray over the corpse of what he believes to be a witch to prevent her from coming out to haunt him, that as on the third night when he should be able to keep her down for good so that she will not rise again from the dead, she indeed invokes this creature, the V. And here's that part where she calls up this creature to come forward. And suddenly there was a silence in the church, and the wolves howling could be heard far away. And soon heavy footsteps rang out in the church. With a sidelong glance, he saw them heading in some leading a squat, hefty, splay-footed man. He was all black earth all over. His earth-covered legs and arms stuck out with strong, sinewy roots. Heavily he trod, stumbling all the time. His long eyelids were lowered to the ground. With horror, Hama, the priest in training, young Orthodox priest in training, noticed that the face of him was made of iron. He was brought under in the arms and put right by the place where Hama stood. And that horrible creature finally does call on all the vampires and werewolves in the room to come and destroy Hama at the end. Still kind of dabbling around in the 19th century, even invoking the word vampire yet. But finally, here we are, A.K. Tolstoy, Alexei Konstantinovich Tolstoy, a distant relative of Leo Tolstoy, the author of War and Peace. By not too much later, by around 1839, 1840, puts out The Family of the Vordalak. Vordalak being a good old, much older term that in South Slavic languages embraces both the character creatures that we know as the werewolf. Literally, the word pulled apart means the one who wears the wolf's skin or wolf's coat, and a vampire itself. So it's a sort of mashup of vampire werewolf. And the idea of this novella that Tolstoy writes in 1839 is that because vampirism is indeed a contagion, that by the time one member of a family has become a vampire, then obviously by biting one, then the next and the other, soon an entire family, and then an entire village could become one large group of vampires. And it's a story of a traveler who finds himself in one of these villages where basically everyone in the village is a Vordalak, or a vampire. And here he's fallen in love with the character of Zdenka. And as he's trying to get Zdenka out of this village, realizing now that she too is a Vordalak or vampire. He just wants to get out to save his own life. And this is that climactic scene at the end. Then his daughter-in-law, who dragged her children with her, threw one of her boys onto the point of a stake, using the stake as a throwing stick. Gorcha, this is the lead vampire, the head vampire, flung the child at me with all his strength. I avoided getting hit, but with truly bulldog-like instinct, the little toad clamped his jaws onto the neck of my horse. I pulled him off with difficulty. The other boy was hurled at me in the same way, but he fell beyond the horse and was crushed under its hooves. A fairly graphic and brutal depiction there for any period. As you can tell, we're moving out of romanticism into romantic realism by this period, but the story very much taking the Slavic vampire story to heart in the family of the Vordalak. These stories continue to the end of the 20th century and even into the 21st century of literary vampires. The writer on the left, Mikhail Bulgakov, brilliant, much repressed writer of the Stalin era, who ultimately writes what, in my humble opinion, is not only the greatest Russian novel, but I do believe it's possibly the greatest novel of the 20th century, The Master and Margarita, writes in that piece. Before that, he actually writes a short story, a little feuilleton, actually, of a short little vampiric story called goodness, I'm blanking on the name. It's taken from the first title, but it's a story of a young boy who, after his death, becomes a vampire, but he cannot be considered a vampire by the community because the paperwork was not submitted in the proper way. So if the Soviet government didn't put the proper stamp on it, he can't be a vampire. It's called When the Dead Rise from the Grave, from a few years before this. But the novel is given the year of 1940, the year of Bulgakov's death, The Master and Margarita, in a section of this surrealist, wonderful novel from that period, 1930s to 1940, is the character of a vampire that appears to dispatch bad Soviet bureaucrats. And you can tell Bulgakov, because his life being tormented by these bureaucrats, spends a good deal of his life writing against them. So Varenucha's, the bureaucrat's hair stood on end because even though the cold water-soaked cloth of his Tolstoy blouse, he could feel that those palms were still colder and that their cold was the cold of ice. This is, of course, the vampire holding him. "Let me give you a kiss," the girl said tenderly, and there were shining eyes right in front of his. Then Varenucha fainted and never felt the kiss. The kiss, of course, Bulgakov's euphemism for the vampire bite in the novels. Wonderful piece. I strongly encourage it. For the late 20th and 21st century, I turned to this writer, Victor Pelevin, possibly kind of the gadfly of the late Soviet period and post-Soviet period, because he writes these incredibly philosophically imbued pieces, both short work and novelistic work, that are often very anti-Soviet, though he's been allowed to remain in the Soviet Union or was allowed to remain for most of the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century. As the Soviet Union has collapsed already in 1991, he writes in one of the first post-Soviet collections of his work in 1998, a story called A Werewolf Problem in Central Russia, which is actually from, I won't read the entire little piece from you there, but it's the perspective of a werewolf fight from the narrator, who himself is a werewolf. And that's why we get this character of the other werewolf. Sasha didn't have an idea of what a fight was like. That's our narrator coming in to Sasha is our hero in the story, but then he will now go on to say it's written as though he's in the middle of this fight and he's watching these other werewolves circle him as they begin the fight. Quite kind of brilliant little parable there about post-Soviet society trying now to find direction, to find, would it be the mafia chiefs at this period in Russian history who would become the so-called wolves or werewolves who would wind up leading the government, or would it still be the ineffectual government of someone like Mr. Yeltsin running the government? Of course, 2 years later, Putin would begin his first term service, as it were, as president of Russia. I want to just also mention a quick series, and then we'll take a little bit of break to let people stretch for a bit. But let me just quickly talk about a sequence also in pop culture from the same period. We saw these great works of the big boys of Russian literature writing pieces in the Gothic about the vampire. Pop music, both from the Soviet period, but especially from the post-Soviet period, also embraced this theme. One of the great bards of the Soviet period, probably in my view, again, the greatest bard, Vladimir Vysotsky, a singer-songwriter, but also an amazing film and especially stage actor. Many consider his Hamlet from the late 60s and through the 70s to be simply one of the best performances of that iconic role of anyone. Wrote a number, not a number, over 700 songs in his very brief lifetime. As you can see, he lived only from born in 1938 and died in 1990. Indeed, flummoxing Brezhnev because he died during those thwarted 1980 Summer Olympic Games that were boycotted by nearly all of the world because of Russia's Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. But he does one interesting little Gothic vampiric piece called My Funeral, in which he sees himself at his own wake. And I wanted to be sure and put both the Russian and the English versions on these songs because of them all being in lyric, to make sure in case we had any Russian speakers out there to kind of see how the Russian plays with these words. This is him imagining what it's like as all of these people parade past him during his wake as he lies in state, and he sees them all as little monsters, little vampires, little werewolves, and so forth. These are the people that he worked with, that he knew, and so forth. So it's a wonderful, as you can see, this where he talks about a very bold little vampire struck me on the knee, chased me down, and on the sly bit into a vein. But the wizened bloodsucker stood by my bedside and gave me an enthusiastic toast about being full-blooded. Yeah, so a lot of satire in these pieces. But in the Soviet period, there weren't that many of these kind of reimaginings simply because the thematic didn't fit in with the Soviet idea of the ideal Soviet man and what Soviet propaganda should look like. So most of them were repressed during the Soviet period. That is, works about vampires or anything that kind of went into this mythic or Gothic genre. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the pop music world goes quite mad with using both Gothic music as one of its major tropes, but also using the vampire story. Again, turning to one of the women artists of this period in the late 1990s, just toward the end of the Yeltsin rule of government, the singer-songwriter Linda, that's her stage name, born Svetlana Gaiman, writes several pieces, a Gothic piece called Varona, the Crow, but then a truly vampiric piece, again, reimagining the female vampire characters, sort of a la Elizabeth Bathory, in a piece from 2003, the early Putin years already, called Девочки с острыми зубками, or girls with little sharp teeth, and invoking this idea of not just that they exist, but rather telling them, do what you do, girls. They go out at night, don't stop them. They bite shoulders, don't forget. Careful, they have a sharp fang and will call you with a pretty fingernail. That these characters are out there, and very much kind of sees them as symbols here of kind of girl power, if you will, in this early period of Mr. Putin. The Gothic becomes fully visible in the post-Soviet period in bands like Picnic, who actually invoke the vampiric theme fully, both by creating full thematic albums, as their 1995 release called Vampirskie Piesni, or Vampiric Songs, which includes one piece called Lish влюбленному vampirу, or Only to a Vampire in Love, where they, again, you might see how this, the lyric in the short stanza blends together the Gothic horror side of the vampire together with the new romanticism of this reimagined Gothic period of the end of the 20th century that trickles all the way into the beginning of the 21st century, with lyrics like, "They just want to drink and drink sweet poison." This kind of oxymoron there of poison being sweet, till morning having fiercely embrace, they will just lie in wait. Again, very lovely vampiric-y themes. But I'll end here this kind of first bit before we take a short little break and I go into a couple of films and a very short second bit to the talk. But as a last piece to talk about a film that was so influential at the end of the 90s called Brat, or The Brother, or simply Brother, filmed by the incomparable director Alexei Balabanov, who unfortunately dies much, much too soon as well. Just a few years after finishing the series of films of The Brother and a few others, and introduces this character. There he is there on the right, Danila Bagrov, kind of embodiment of this new Russian man and of the conflict between a person, as his character is, of someone who's done his duty. He served in the military, goes and serves in the Chechen War on the Russian border, learning the skills of being a military person and creating on his own improvised explosive devices and how to kill another human being and so forth, but remains nonetheless conscience, trying now, having been demobbed, coming back to his to Moscow in this particular scene where that image is taken from, and trying to somehow manage to justify, rectify what he did as a soldier, as a kind of vampire in the Chechen region, coming back now to Moscow and trying to become a human being again. It's a wonderful film, by the way. It's highly recommend it for you. It's certainly available on Netflix or any other streaming service. The Brother, take a look at it. But from that piece, in the storyline, the director has run this thread of Danila's character being infatuated with a band who was very popular precisely at this time in the late 1990s, and a band that the character becomes infatuated by, not only because he loves the new sound, this new Gothic of the late 20th century, but he loves the message that this band is performing that speak directly to him. The band is this group called Nautilus Pompilius, just wonderfully creative band, a little bit controversial now because it's come out in the last year since the invasion of Ukraine, that members of this band were remain in favor of Russia's invasion of that band. But at the time, in the late 90s and early 21st century, the band was considered one of the quintessential Russian goth rock bands, and put out in 1997, the same year that the film Brat, The Brother, was released, a record, an album called Yabloko Kitai, or literally it means Chinese apple, which is the Russian word for orange. It's the title of the song. And in it is a song that has, again, an oxymoronic kind of title, A Gentle Vampire. So I put up, this is the full set of lyrics, both in Russian and in English, just to give you a sense, the irony in the, or oxymoronic sense in the title, gentle and vampiric or vampire, play throughout all of the song as the lyrics describe the duality, the controversy of the late 20th century in Russia, of what it is to be a new Russian. As it says in the middle stanza, a gentle vampire, an innocent child, like a gentle vampire rise, and then describes what Russian youth are like now. Your girlfriends, they sniff glue. Every day they become a little more stupid. In this country, sticky like mud, you can get fat, you can disappear. So seemingly very anti-Russian administrative, Russian government lyrics here as well, so sort of showing the vampire as this creature trying to bring out those the real lives of Russian youth. And our hero, Danila Bagrov, in the Brother story, really empathizes and sympathizes with this perspective, and through the film keeps wanting to find more and more of their records. In a wonderful scene where he's actually creating an improvised explosive device to help his brother, hence the title of the film. This song is playing in the background, and I wanted to be able to play just a bit of this for you before we take a break here. So this is the song Gentle Vampire, but I wanted you also to see it's the music video that goes with it from Russia, MTV Russia, how the group really used the vampiric Gothic images to carry the message of the day. I'm going to stop it at that point, only because it's a nice, chunky, wonderfully Gothic song that I encourage you to take a full listen to. But I'm going to, just as my parting shot here before it takes a little bit of a stretch, I've wittered on too long here for you. But the second vampire that you see, so the first vampire singer that we see is the lead singer of the band, Vyacheslav Batusov, the writer of the song. The second vampire that we see toward the end of that little bit that I showed, simply his good friend and also just one of the founders of Russian and post-Soviet Russian rock. His name Grebenshchikov, from the band, the incredible band from the 1980s, 90s, and to present day in immigration now in the United States. The band Aquarium comes and does his little guest second solo to sing as the other vampire in the song. So just want to give you that as our first bit of the portrait. If we take about, say, a 5-minute break here in the second, just promise no more than 15 minutes. I want to go through a sequence of vampire films from the late 20th, early 20th century, and finish up with a couple of contemporary political images of the vampire in Moscow today.
Okay, great. So thank you so much. Again, we will take a break for about 5 minutes. I have 3:06 p.m. Eastern time on my clock. So if we could come back around 3:11, then we will have the rest of the formal presentation and then a Q&A session. We do have a number of questions coming into the chat, so please feel free to keep them coming and we will address all of them as time permits.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I promise I've got into my, I think, academic lecturer mode there, and I always get caught up in my own subject matter here. So I promise I'll keep my remarks in this last little bit very, very brief to kind of give you just a bit of the filmic history of the contemporary period, and then I really want to get to some of these terrific questions that I was kind of skimming through during the break here. So staying in this end of the 20th, beginning of the 20th century period, it's actually this guy, sort of unlikely Stephen King-like, incredibly prolific pop novel writer from Belarus, Sergei Lukyanenko, writes beginning in 1998 what most all was just a pulp fiction vampire trash novel called The Night Watch. A fantastic futuristic portrait of what Russia might look like if indeed many of us in the population were vampires. But he does a cool thing of dividing his vampires into two types, a so-called night watch, or good vampires who patrol over keeping humanity safe from the vampire population at large, and the Day Watch, the kind of evil, bad vampires that are committed to taking over the entire world themselves with the vampiric contagion, if you will. It turned out that this was not simply pulp fiction, but instead became a phenom. Quickly, between the years of 1998 and 2003, the trilogy of Night Watch, Day Watch, and Evening Watch appear. Twilight Watch, if you want to. By the time we're in 2003, he comes up with the idea of Twilight and vampires before it's popularized in the United States by Stephanie Meyer, but then continues. I didn't include it here because the trilogy is considered its own thing, but the Watch series went on until I want to say 2016 or 17. I believe the 7th installation came out in probably, for all I know, because I haven't been back since 2020, there may be new versions or new editions out now. But that novel then was serialized not only in novelistic form, but also in cinematic form, just after the trilogy was completed in 2003. In 2004, wonderful intersectional identity, Timur Bekmambetov, Russian-speaking but Kazakh by birth. They say not simply your white Russian male director, decides to take on the very difficult task of putting on into film the idea of a contemporary new version of the Russian vampire story as very post-colonial, in many ways anti-colonial, anti-empire stories of how we deal with each other in a globalized, multicultural, multi-ethnic world in the story of Night Watch. So in the piece, and indeed in the iteration of the film, the lead character depicted here is this unwitting vampire, because he's well into his 30s before he even discovers that he's part of the Night Watch, that he does have these powers of becoming a vampire. And that's indeed is part and parcel of the story, is that some of us may not even know that we are these creatures until we dig deep and tap those powers. The character that is that vampire, his character name is Anton Gorodetsky. He is this idea of a new Russian man, a different kind of Russian man, but his secret is that he is indeed one of those vampires of the Night Watch that's trying to protect, by virtue that there is this young new vampire they want to, that is his son, to protect him so that he also becomes part of the Night Watch. Shortly after the release, which of the massive popularity of this film, by the way, considered by all accounts, not just a box office mega hit in terms of the amount of money that it raised, it was one of the very, very first films of New Russia, Putin's Russia, to be released globally. Fox Searchlight bought the rights to the film here in the US and the rest of the English-speaking world, took care of not only doing the subtitling of the film and editing of the film for an American, a US market, but also for creating a doublage, a dubbed version of the film with very carefully matched up voices and character sounds for the English language production of it. They also co-produced, then Fox Searchlight co-produced the English version of the second film in 2006-2007 of Dnevnoy Dozor, or The Day Watch, which met with not quite as great success, but did very, very well indeed. And the story continues now with the new generation of the vampire story, his son now reaching that age where he has to decide whether he's going to go to the side of the Night Watch or the side of the Day Watch. And it brings the vampire story well out now of that romanticized version of the other that really gets, I guess, crystallized by Bram Stoker and other romantic era, Victorian era writers in the English language, to a much more contemporary, to this day, Putin era Russian vampire in the Day Watch series. The Watch series was, by all accounts, an entire phenomenon that Mr. Putin was very, very much against, could not abide the fact that this, not both at the book series, the novel series, was such an amazing success, and that then the filmic versions of it were equally incredible successes, because they depicted Russia, in his words, they depicted Russia as an evil empire. I'm just going to leave that there and let you all think about that a bit. From those words to these images of Putin in the blogosphere and in the cyberspace that is the internet in the 21st century in Putin's Russia. Keep in mind, by the way, that my students, who are all in their right around 20 or early 20s, their contemporaries in Russia would not know a Russia without Mr. Putin as president. So Putin first comes to power at the end of 1999 when Yeltsin relinquishes his power to his prime minister, Vladimir Putin, and then Putin is officially elected president for his first term in 2000 and has not been out of power since, even for that short period that Dmitry Medvedev was president of Russia in the still in the knots of the 2000, from 2008 to 2012, Putin maintained his role as prime minister. So he was still very much part of the Russian mentality of who is running this country. So Russia as an entity is very much a Putin thing. When Time magazine puts Mr. Putin on the cover of as the person of the year, very quickly the internet space takes that image and turns it into what, rather than person of the year, but a vampire of the year, seeing Mr. Putin's desire to take what he can from Russia and give back nothing, that all that taking is what is sustaining him in this never aging and never dying role of Russian leader, everything from the wars in Chechnya to his maltreatment of minority populations within the other minority populations within the Russian borders, to 2022 and his incursion into Ukraine. This portrait has increased in popularity in the last years rather than fade away as part of his reputation. Indeed, the meme on the right appeared just before, after in 2014, after the Malaysian airline plane crash over Ukraine and Mr. Putin's annexation of Crimea, taking it from Ukraine and making it through a referendum, part of Russia proper. This meme of turning the vampiric image of Mr. Putin into that very famous portrait of Vlad Tepes Dracula, so that we have Putin as Dracula made clear. In very last thing to say, that this image of Mr. Putin as a modern day Russian vampire has not quite the opposite of diminishing, has only increased in frequency in recent years now, since the invasion of Ukraine, as international journals have taken on Mr. Putin and tried to deal with it. These were a couple of Polish journals plus the National Review cover, these all from the last 5 years or so, all depicting Mr. Putin in various ways in a vampiric fashion, including, I love the National Review one because it really overlays that look of Nosferatu to the sort of tweaked portrait of Bloody there as the Bloody Tsar. In fact, Putin has, for those of us who do the vampire myth from its beginnings in about 2,000 plus years ago for the Western world, to present day, allows me to continue making talks about the Slavic vampire and specifically focusing on Russia and bringing it to present day to say not only is the myth not diminishing in its import as part of both popular and greater cultural importance, but rather is an imbued part of the Russian mindset and of the contemporary Russian scene. And with that, we'll turn to the wonderful image of the Count to open things up for questions. And I know there are some both in chat, and I would love to hear from some of you who would want to turn on your mic and let me hear from you individually. I'll just open it up for questions now.
This question is, were 1991 to 92 key years for a substantial increase in the production of vampiric media and publishing of vampire literature?
So maybe I didn't get the question part. I got that not between 91 and 92, an increase in the production of vampire literature.
And media, yes.
And the question is, why was there?
Just if those were key years, I guess that's tracking with the Bram Stoker's Dracula film, but was there kind of I guess a surge in that type of media around that time?
There was, and one is now, I should say one, that would mean I and others who look at the historic lines of what is happening globally, what is happening in the world, where vampire literature or cultural products are coming out in larger numbers, is what is going on when these events happen. So indeed, if we look back to that period of the early 90s, for us in the US, the Bush years of, especially with the first Gulf War, and the matching up of blood for oil. And there, I'm not using that metaphor at all. Ironically, I'm using it quite factually because of the war effort in the Middle East and the invasion of Iraq at the time. The idea that oil equals blood was so easy to be transformed into one of the many vampire stories that then did indeed occur in the United States and in Western Europe, probably Bram Stoker's Dracula being the most visible of the pieces that came out during this period. In Britain, a number of pieces came out as well a little bit later, a couple of years later. The Wisdom of Crocodiles, very, again, also anti-empire kind of postmodern, post-colonial piece came out, and others. If we mapped, say, the productions by Anne Rice and her sequence of vampire stories in the 1980s, those trend almost letter for letter, if you will, with the AIDS epidemic and the Reagan era's non-response to AIDS in the US. She makes the connection between the vampire epidemic as a contagion and AIDS and one blood disease with another blood disease. So all these periods of cultural or political upheaval tend to then coincide with a rise in Gothic or horror literature or cultural products. So that early 90s period is exactly a good catch on why we had these stories and films coming out then.
Thank you. And then Greg, I think you had a question, if you'd like to go next.
Sure. Tom, first of all, thank you for, what can I say, quite a presentation. My question is, I'm always intrigued by the timing of things. You have Bram Stoker, who was British, I believe. His book came out in 1897. And that was just, you had Jack the Ripper, striking just a few years earlier than that.
Correct.
And, my analytical skills told me that there might be some inspiration for the book coming out when it did. So I just wanted to get your thought on that.
10 out of 10, Greg, and thank you so much for the kind remarks about the presentation, but you've got that exactly right. So two things, one little minor correction, but an important one here, because Stoker was ethnically and born in and ethnically Irish, but did indeed do all of his work in London, and therefore was in that very uncomfortable position of always being the ethnic other in very much British or English Britain. So he was towing a line constantly. He writes about this both in his diaries and a number of his works, including Dracula, about that just because you speak English doesn't mean you're accepted within an English-speaking environment, or just because you speak Russian doesn't mean you're accepted in a Russian-speaking environment, and so on. So that part very much played into his notion of watching populations now coming at the end of the 19th century because of the pogroms in Europe, of Jewish populations coming through Western Europe and meeting with great racial, ethnic, othering resistance, that is resistance to anything because of xenophobia, anything different from who we are. That played into it. And that xenophobia played into the craze around Jack the Ripper. Do you remember the story around Jack the Ripper? The initial two individuals who were arrested for and accused of being the Ripper were both
Well, it was
Jews.
a Polish, yeah, it was a Polish doctor, I think.
Exactly, because he had surgical skills, but nonetheless, that gave him that kind of, what is it, means and motive, but then kind of circumstances where, and to top it all off, you're a Jewish migrant here, so let's put the blame on you, literally making you a scapegoat. Stoker was in that very, very royal environment, so you hit it exactly right. It's late for the Gothic period. I mean, many around him who were, his friends, as he's writing the novel, saying, hey, dude, really, the Gothic period's over. You're writing a Gothic novel in the 1890s. No one's interested. But it's not simply a Gothic novel. It's a novel about the present times, about the late Victorian period, and specifically about the ethnicism, racism, xenophobia, swirling around the Jack the Ripper story, and in focusing on in London, that it made a perfect petri dish for his novel to take place in. Thank you so much for that question. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And since I got your attention, I don't
Please.
want to, I'll ask one more question, then I won't bother you anymore. My own background, my area of interest is China.
Right.
And I know you haven't said anything at all about China. I'm just curious. I don't know anything about this. Do they have a vampire tradition at all that you know of?
They do, and indeed, the vampire Japanese, Korean. I don't know. I'm not an Asianist, so I don't know much at all about Southeast Asia. I know of the Kali stories from South Asia, and that those are indeed already put those in the Western context because they're those stories that get transported across the Bosphorus into the Balkans. But in the East, there are incredibly vivid and vibrant stories, the Far East. And those three countries, China, Japan, and Korea, all have vampire stories traditions that predate the Western tradition by at least 1,000 years, maybe
Yeah,
longer.
I'm not surprised. Okay.
And so, yeah, the idea of a revenant, blood-drinking god in the other countries, although three of those countries, they were demigods or full gods, those figures are both present and recurring in the literature. I mean, I know more about the Japanese tradition here because of films that came out in the late 1900s, the late 20th century or the early 21st century, films like The Ring and The Grudge that take this idea of emotional vampires or these, yeah, that's the best word for it. Vampires that don't drink blood directly, but rather take life force from people, which is what the vampire story is in China, Japan, and Korea. So yes, there is a very robust and much older tradition in those countries. It's just not one that I know the languages of well enough at all to be able to do any kind of work in or research in. That's why I've kind of stuck to the Slavic realm. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Something for me to research on my own. I'll let
Please.
someone else talk. Thank you.
Please, and if you do share with me, please. If you,
Yeah, I just might do that because
Thank you.
I'm interested in stuff like that. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Great, thank you. So I think our next question is from Elizabeth, if you want to go ahead.
Hi. So hi, Tom. I have to say, I was a colleague of yours at the Foreign Service Institute, but it was a really long time ago, but I was in French and I remember you. And when I saw this email, this is one of my favorite topics for literature and movies. And I said, and Tom is going to, it was just fantastic to listen to your lecture. And it's really, really nice to see you.
Wonderful to see you as well. Goodness, I saw your name up here and I went, it can't be the same person. And
yeah,
I'm so glad to
yeah.
see you.
So my question is very simple and just about the name Nosferatu.
Yes.
Two of my favorite movies are the one that you showed, I guess it's a silent movie, the very first one there. And then I think it's Werner Herzog who did
yes.
Nosferatu as well with the German actor Bruno, someone who recently died, and Isabella Gianni, and Wagner's The Ring, and him going over the mountains, the Carpathian Mountains and so forth. I can't see that movie enough. I just think there's a beauty to it that's very interesting to me. and compelling. So anyway, I wondered where that name for Dracula came from.
So it is one that comes within that Eastern European frame. Again, its origins are in the Balkans. So it goes, if you take the etymology all the way back, it comes from a Greek origin. The Greek etymology is one that or something that passes on disease, a contagion, basically. In its Romanian interpolation, which uses two of the same roots, the nos and the fer, but then uses Romanian endings, that atu ending that we get, the nosferatu, it is colloquially translated as the carrier of the plague. But again, it means one who brings disease.
I see.
And more now, just because it was a word that already had been attributed in kind of the I guess I'll call it popular culture, but meaning out in non-urban areas, in rural areas, it was a term used to describe a vampire, along with lamia, strigoi, and a few other terms that are often related to vampires. He chose it because it had that close connection to the region that he wanted the Nosferatu to be coming from, as did Dracula from Transylvania, Romania. So he chose that word.
I
Yeah.
guess in the countryside and so forth, and my husband does some work in Bosnia and Serbia and so forth, and the Balkans, and so that is very much, I think, part of the kind of cultural traditions there too. I don't know in
Right.
what ways it still manifests itself today, but
It does. I think in fact, just before COVID, the last kind of big news media story, the kind of news blast story about unearthing a real vampire came out of Serbia in 2020. These come out about every few years, where some family has suspicions that someone else in the family has, as they call it, the contagion, the disease, and they wind up then unearthing relatives to see if indeed anything has changed. And the story was, as I remember it, from 2019, 2020, unearthing someone outside of goodness, it was getting close, I believe, to the Bosnian border. So just well outside of the big cities, Belgrade and so forth, but unearthing this individual and finding a stone, a large, like a brick, in between their teeth, to prevent it from biting down. Therefore, the story went, therefore proving that whenever they buried him, they had suspicions he was indeed a vampire back then, 100 years ago or whatever. So yes, in short, those stories are very much a part of the culture there to present day. Yeah.
Yeah, that's something. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So great to see you again, by the way, Elizabeth. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. Our next question is from Nicola, if you'd like to ask your question.
Please.
Hello, thanks for the talk. It's been really interesting. So my question was, if you think of the depiction of Dracula kind of by Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee as this very handsome aristocrat, do you think the source of that is kind of more Polidori's vampire rather than the Bram Stoker version?
What a terrific question. I want you in my undergrad class. It's exactly the kind of bringing together of the literary tradition and the cultural tradition. So the short answer is yes, but if I can just elaborate a tiny bit, because the one difference is that, so Polidori's source, Lord Ruthven, is indeed the educated, suave. Indeed, he's one of our first kind of sex symbol vampires. There's even question, as there always was during that Diodati period, where was it Mary Shelley who really wrote Frankenstein, or was it actually her? Was it Percy Bysshe Shelley? And the same thing here: was it really Polidori who wrote the vampire, or was it Byron who wrote the vampire? I'm very much believing that it was indeed both Mary Shelley and Polidori who wrote it. But that said, creating this idea that the vampire could be one of us. So Lord Ruthven is not from here, but he's also not from way over there either. He's still a European aristocrat. So he fits into still one of us being the vampire. So the only difference where I draw the distinction is creating this idea, as Todd Browning did, the count, suave, sophisticated, educated, vampire definitely has its roots in Polidori's The Vampire with a Y. But the reimagining of this character as the other, the ethnic other, one from not from our side of Europe, but from that other place. Transylvania was perfect because by virtue of its very name, and here's a little bit more of that fun linguistic stuff, right? Transsylvan, across the forest, not our side, but the other side of the forest. He comes into our country. You know, how dare you come in through Whitby to beautiful England and into London and bring the contagion with you, right? So it's a bit of a mashup. The beautiful count, the sexy count coming from Polidori, the othering of it all coming from Stoker. Or even if we want to say coming from I'd say Stoker and then later Murnau's vampire as well. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. As if I could just also the last bit, my students always catch on to this bit quickly too, is that as they say, who would want to, if I were in my bedroom and Nosferatu came into my bedroom, I would go running crazy out of the room screaming because he's hideous, he's ugly, he's terrifying. But if one of these suave, sexy vampires like Lord Ruthven came in, I might give in. Yeah. It was a lot easier to buy into the story of being vampirized once you had the sexy, pretty vampires that we get in the Victorian period. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, great. So our next question is from Eva Rose. I know she does not have a working microphone, so I'm going to ask it on her behalf. And she says, I'm unsure which is older, witches are vampires, but Elizabeth Bathory's story might have made more sense if she was using menstrual blood of girls as they transitioned from childhood to adolescence, but I don't think that's ever been suggested. Was her alleged belief that bathing in blood would preserve the youthfulness of her skin from some sort of Christian belief associated with the blood of Christ and eternal life?
What a terrific question. All of these questions are so good. They're so wonderfully rich and nuanced. So there are a number of interpretations of the story so most of what we get from her story, let me kind of cut to it. She had a so-called manservant that was with her constantly, who apparently wrote much of her story down in diary pieces that were preserved, were maintained. Their authenticity is questionable. So that said, that we've got these sort of bits of what we think might be Bathory stories, but through the lens of a person that probably found it difficult working for her is already complicated enough, but there were just so many more complicating factors. Bathory herself did not keep any kind of journals that survive to present day. There are, what we do have that we know are reliable sources, bits and pieces of the transcripts of her trial and the testimony of those who survived her, escaped being kept in prisoner under house arrest. So all of that comes together to what little bits and pieces are the theories here. The most reliable, or the most, I should say, agreed upon version of the story of her blood equals youth decision came from a story about at some point during her routine of getting dressed, her morning toilette, she was being combed, and in the process of combing, the servant girl cut her with the metal teeth of the comb. Bathory smacks her away and wipes away the blood, and in wiping away the blood then sees that as she keeps doing this, pulling away the blood as it drips down her face, that her skin looks not surprisingly, or maybe just unsurprisingly because of the red of the blood, appears ruddier and therefore more youthful. That's the most kind of one story that seems to have a kind of through line that is consistent in how she came to that conclusion, and therefore then went from give me a little bit of blood that I can use to wipe on my face or put on my face as part of my cosmetics in the morning to covering my body with it. And even then, yes, the kind of grotesque side of it, bathing in blood, which again, with no documentation anywhere that ever occurred, but it's a good Gothic story to tell, and it does fully bring out the story. Now, whether that was connected to menstrual cycle, menstrual blood, coming of youth, coming of age, all of that, all of those stories are completely both plausible and make for a good way of trying to come to the conclusion that she in her own mind came to about young girls' blood being good for her, keeping her own youth. More, or maybe not more possible or probable, but also possible was that, yes, to the earlier question about witches and the vampire story, the story of sorcery, witchcraft, and witchery predates the story of vampires and eternal life by several hundred years, if not even close to I'd say getting close to maybe 700, 800, nearly 1,000 years. It's a much older story about invocation of, because of paganism, invocation not of the good gods, but also the unclean forces, as they were called in the Eastern European world, these so-called necistiacili, the unclean forces. So yeah, a little complicated answer there, but it's such a good question as to, what the whyness of it all is. One, I think everyone who reads Bathory's story, which, by the way, got just before COVID twice reimagined on film. One's very nice, short-lived Hollywood film because I believe COVID shut everything down. But it was a film called simply Bathory, with Giulia Delpy starring in it. Very interesting reimagining of the Bathory story. So there are some newer versions of that longer tale being retold in the last 10 years. Thank you for that terrific question. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. So our next question is from Eileen, who has asked me to read her question.
Sure.
Is there a correlation between vampirism and Catholic exorcisms?
Oh, there's interesting. None that I've thought of. I'm going to give that some more thought. Well, because I thought when I heard that question starting, I thought I knew where it was going. So let me kind of just say where the connection between vampirism and Christianity is in a kind of dualistic sense. So as the Slavic world starts becoming Christian around the 9th and 10th centuries, the vampire story had already been pagan tradition, that there were these creatures that came back from the dead and they were parasitic in nature. They fed and maintained their undead quality states by drinking and taking the life of those among the living. That story, as it then had to be mapped onto what could be intelligible through dualism with Christian belief, the drinking of the blood of Christ and the eating of the body of Christ and taking the Eucharist was very quickly mapped onto the idea of, well, you do that and you get eternal life. We all know the story from Ecclesiastes, Deuteronomy, of the blood is the life, but we are being asked to therefore eat of the body and blood of Christ so that we too, like Christ, may come back from the dead. The story of Christ, the mythos, if you will, of the Christ story, very early on in the Christianization of the Balkans and then later of Russia, which was centered around Kiev in Ukraine, was in 988. And from that time on, from the 10th, 11th, even into the 12th century, as Christianity spread through the larger Rusian region before Muscovy, or actually right around the time Muscovy begins to become its own principality, all relied on that elision of the vampire story and the Christ eternal life story, the coming back from the dead story. So that was long-winded again, I'm sorry, but that's the kind of Christian vampire link that I'm most aware of. I love your question and will simply admit ignorance of a way that I could come up with to overlay the two stories. I was raised Catholic, so it's one that resonates with me a bit, and yet I don't see the immediate parallel there, but might check. I will check in a bit more into that. So thank you very much for that question.
Oh, yeah, just, well, first of all, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And so interesting.
Thank you.
So I just had an add-on to, I think it was Ia had to say about Bathory.
Yes.
And I think you already answered it, mentioning the movie that was on Netflix. And that brought me to do some searching on Bathory. And just her situation as being a woman in power, betrayed by her brother. I don't, who knows? I'm not sure. It's a lot to look.
So there are, yes, and there are, it's wonderful because in, the post-Me Too movement and kind of a new fifth wave feminism and so forth, a lot of my current Gen Z students really glom on to Bathory's stories, especially those who identify female, really do see her story as first and foremost, before any of the vampire mythos gets layered on top. They see it as very empowering because, yes, she had a domineering and dominating husband, problematic blood family as well. As you mentioned, her brother, her relationship with her brother was also very, very difficult. And some even, there are suggestions of some kind of incestuous abuse, perhaps. All that said, when she rises to power after the death of her husband, she makes the decision, for whatever reason, that she needs to prove that she is as powerful as her husband was. And that becomes this now point for good conversation. Was that decision an empowering one for her? Or was that ultimately her capitulating to a kind of a hegemonic, male-oriented, dominant type of behavior that led ultimately to her needing to take power through vampirization to show that she could even exert her own power, not only against the men waging war as her husband did, but even among the young women around her. It gets really complicated. And I love the fact that in the 2020s, a number of films now, and I'm thinking of the one in particular called simply Bathory, and there's another one, I think it's called The Blood Countess. It came out around the same period, are new reimaginings of a novel version, a sort of historical novel that came out, and I'm going to be really embarrassed here not remembering the author's name, that came out called The Blood Countess, 2018, 19, I want to say. So there is a new interest in the Bathory story because I think the time is right in the current situation with gender relations, gender understanding and comprehension, and of trying to find more equitable ways of portraying women in film to make the Bathory story much more, or once again, relevant and impactful. And the Delpy one, the Julie Delpy film, is very good in that regard, I think, in my opinion. Yeah. Thank you for raising that again.
Yeah, I was just thinking also there is, with the disinformation campaigns, it also happened to Marie Antoinette.
Yes, yes.
Amazing.
I mean, yeah, women and people of color in power always get these narratives written about them that are clearly not meant not to keep them in power, or meant to, in a way, undermine, as you say, with like disinformation, to undermine their reigns and their power. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for the question. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'd love to ask a question. Again, I don't think we have any more in the chat.
Please.
But I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on some of the major differences between how vampires are depicted in American literature and media versus European and especially Russian. Like, one thing that I've noticed is, and just again in my own personal consumption of media, is that in American media, vampires are often pictured as coming from very poor or modest backgrounds. And if they've accumulated wealth, it's because they've had more than one human lifetime to do so. Whereas in European and Russian media, they're often coming from these, aristocratic or high-level military backgrounds, which I think reflect different cultural norms. And of course, in America, we don't have aristocracy in the sense of inherited titles. And, of course, there are still different social classes, but it's supposed to be the land of opportunity where everyone can build something from nothing. Whereas, that might be harder in places that have nobility.
Absolutely. You're right on the mark. Thank you for that, Emily. And I love being able to talk about in our with our students and in classes and lectures and so forth, how those different dynamics allow us really to look at the ways that divergence. So I want to change the emphasis, not divergence, but divergence, that is moving it out into two different directions, and difference are played out as part of the vampiric stories that we get. And you're quite right. I think the tradition of empire, which has its own way of playing out class through an aristocracy, through family title lines, and through bloodlines, no pun intended, allows for the story to become one of being, really focusing on otherness as being not from here. When you say that the person we're talking about from not from here happens to be one with a title, from privilege, from power. So that means what we're really focusing on as our reason not to find this, or maybe that we find this person problematic, is because they are from not here. The ones from this side of the Atlantic really do, as you correctly point out, don't so much look at that distinction in terms, certainly not in terms of noble title or that kind of class, but often indeed in terms of class that has to do with background, upbringing, and access to money and or power, which in the US tend to be terribly, maybe problematically interlinked. I love the fact, I'm going to take just a couple of quick examples. So from the 2000s, my favorite contemporary portrait in American film that I think really got to the heart of the what the vampire story means in the Americas, because it takes place in Alaska. So it's not simply US bound the way, or New Orleans, San Francisco, the way the Anne Rice stories are. But this is David Slade's production of 30 Days of Night, which takes it's a wonderful vampiric idea of that if indeed we take from the vampire myth story that vampires can only come out at night, then what would they do if they went to a place where the sun doesn't rise for 30 days in the far, near polar region of the American Alaskan region? And so the vampires in that story are very much this kind of ragtag group of clearly not from your upper classes, certainly not from any kind of nobility. And what I especially appreciate is not only do you recognize that through the way they dress, they've kind of put together a sort of postmodern swap shop or secondhand store way of reimagining what nice clothes would look like, but with patches and tears and all in them. And they don't simply have the two neat front fangs. They're the animalistic, full set of truly canine-like teeth from an animal that rip out throats rather than the neat, simple bite of a European vampire. David Slade, in my humble opinion, created a wonderful 21st century vampire in 30 Days of Night. And the idea, and I left out, they also run in packs, like pack animals, going back to the Vordelac tradition. So all of this is so directly to your point that this very American vampire there and in other stories as well, so much more speaks to the story of a post-colonial country itself built out of settler immigrants, settler colonials. Is who makes an other, who is going to be the other when you've got a country, a nation, a place that's made up of those same others that were thrown out of the European tradition. Yeah. Great question. So grateful for that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
So any other questions? I think we have just a couple of minutes left before the end of our time.
Anything else? Even it doesn't have to be about vampires.
Well, all right then. I think we can go ahead and wrap up. So I'll just say thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and for your thoughtful answers to all of our questions. And on behalf of the museum, we really, truly appreciate your time.
Bravo to you, and thank you to all of our guests who came today to enjoy this presentation. So,
and thank you all again so much for setting it up, and happy Halloween to everyone, and happy Dia de los Muertos.